They told Mira she was expendable before she even left the capital. Not in those words, of course. Diplomats rarely said what they meant. But she understood the subtext perfectly when Lord Seven handed her the treaty terms with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. When the king's advisor declined to attend the summit himself, citing pressing matters that Mira knew for certain didn't exist. When her own escort, 6 soldiers, was quietly halved to 3 on the morning of departure with no explanation offered. She was being sent to Vael. The Vael territories had been encroaching on Aldenmere's eastern border for 2 years. Farmland seized, trade routes blocked, 3 Aldenmere scouts missing, presumed dead. War was coming regardless, and someone in the capital wanted it to come. Someone who would profit from the conflict stood to lose everything if Mira somehow succeeded where every previous envoy had refused to even try. She was 26 years old, the youngest senior diplomat in Aldenmere's history, with no family connections, no political allies, and nothing to lose. The perfect person to send on an impossible mission. The perfect person to blame when it failed. What no one had told her. What no one could have told her, because no one knew, was that the moment her delegation crossed the Vael border, the Alpha King had felt it. A pull so violent it had brought him to his knees in the middle of his war council. A certainty as absolute as gravity. His mate had arrived, and she had 3 days to stop a war. Neither of them understood yet what an impossible position that was. Not until the first meeting. Not until their eyes met across a stone war table, covered in maps and grievances, and everything that stood between 2 kingdoms on the edge of destroying each other. He knew what she was to him. She had no idea. And somewhere between the first negotiation session and the last desperate hour of the 3rd day, everything either of them had planned would fall apart completely. Day 1. Morning Mira. The Vael stronghold was nothing like the reports describe. Mira had read every document Aldenmere's intelligence service had compiled on the Wolf King's seat of power. Stone fortress, the report said. Crude, militaristic. Built for war rather than governance. She'd prepared herself for something brutish and cold, a warlord's castle dressed up with minimal ceremony. What she found instead, as her carriage crested the final hill, was a city carved into the mountain itself. Towers of pale granite rose from the rock face like natural formations, as though the mountain had simply decided to become a castle one day and hadn't stopped growing. The walls were covered in climbing vines. Despite the late autumn cold, their leaves turned to fire, crimson and copper and deep burning gold, so that the entire stronghold looked like it was perpetually lit from within. She absorbed this in silence, filing it away with everything else she'd learned since crossing the border. The Vael people were not what she'd expected either. Every village they'd passed through had been orderly, prosperous, the roads well maintained, the markets full. Children had watched her carriage pass with open curiosity rather than fear. Soldiers at the checkpoints had been professional, courteous. Nothing like the brutal enforcers the capital's reports described. Either Aldenmere's intelligence was catastrophically wrong, or someone had been writing those reports to serve a particular conclusion. Mira suspected the latter. Impressive? Murmured Captain Doven beside her, his tone suggesting he found it anything but. He was the senior of her 3-man escort, loyal to Lord Seven rather than to Mira, and he'd been making his disapproval of this entire mission quietly, but consistently clear since they'd left the capital. "Isn't it?" Mira agreed pleasantly. The carriage descended toward the main gate. Mira smoothed the front of her traveling coat. Dark wool, practical. Nothing that suggested either wealth or poverty. And reviewed what she knew about the man she was about to face. Alpha King Caspian Vael, 31 years old. Assumed the title at 20 when his father died under circumstances the official record called a hunting accident, and everyone else called something else entirely. Had consolidated 3 fractious wolf packs into a unified territory within his first 2 years. No wife, no consort, no acknowledged heirs, despite considerable pressure from his pack to produce them. Known for patience in council, brutality in battle, and a control over his wolf form that other alphas reportedly found unsettling. Most shifters, even powerful ones, showed their wolf nature in small ways. A flash of gold in the eyes under strong emotion, a tension in the body that spoke of barely contained power. Caspian Vael, according to every account she'd found, showed nothing. The man was described as a locked room. Good, Mira thought. She knew how to pick locks. The gate opened before them. A delegation waited in the courtyard. A beta wolf in formal attire, 2 advisors, a handful of guards whose discipline and stillness marked them as elite. Their scents. Mira couldn't smell them, of course. But she'd learned to read wolf body language in the years she'd spent negotiating with pack territories. Were carefully neutral. She stepped down from the carriage before anyone could assist her and met the beta's eyes directly. "Mira Ashvane," she said, "Senior Diplomatic Envoy for the Kingdom of Aldenmere. We're grateful for the welcome." The beta, a tall man with dark eyes and a scar running through one eyebrow, studied her for a moment. His expression was unreadable, but something shifted in it when she held his gaze without flinching. "Beta Ren," he said, "His Majesty will receive you at midday." Not a greeting, a scheduling notice. Mira smiled as if this were exactly what she'd expected. "Of course," she said. "We'll look forward to it." As she was led inside, she caught Ren glancing back at her once, a quick assessing look she couldn't quite interpret. Not hostility, not welcome either. Something closer to concern. Day 1. Before the meeting Caspian, he'd known the moment she crossed the border. He'd been standing at the war table with his generals, reviewing the eastern boundary maps for the 4th time that week, when it hit him. A scent that wasn't a scent, because she was miles away, but something his wolf knew with the absolute certainty of bone and blood and everything he was. Mate. The word had moved through him like a blade. He'd gripped the edge of the table hard enough to crack the wood. His generals had gone silent, watching him with the careful stillness of men who understood that their king was fighting something and had the wisdom not to ask what. "Leave," he'd said. They'd left. He'd stood alone in the council chamber for 20 minutes, breathing deliberately, forcing the wolf back with every tool he had. In 10 years as Alpha, he'd never lost control. He was not going to lose it now over a woman he hadn't met yet. His mate, his fated mate, who was apparently a human diplomat from the kingdom that had been systematically undermining his territory's trade routes for 2 years, who had arrived with a 3-man escort, insultingly small, and terms he already knew were designed to be unacceptable. He'd received the preliminary documents that morning. Aldenmere wanted the border redrawn in their favor. Compensation for the scouts they claimed his wolves had killed, and the reopening of trade routes on their terms. In exchange, they offered a non-aggression pact worth approximately nothing and a reduction in tariffs that still left Vael at a severe disadvantage. They wanted him to capitulate. The terms were an opening position designed to humiliate rather than negotiate. He'd have rejected them immediately if not for Wren's message that had arrived an hour later. She came alone, Caspian. The woman they sent. Small delegation. No political allies, no safety net. She's been set up to fail. Whatever they've told her to offer isn't what they're actually after. Wren had a gift for reading people. If he said the Aldenmere envoy had been sent as a sacrificial piece in someone else's game, Caspian believed him. Which meant the real question wasn't what she'd come to offer. It was whether she knew she'd been sacrificed. He dressed for the meeting with more care than he usually gave such things. Not because he wanted to impress her, he told himself firmly, but because presentation in diplomacy mattered, and he was, above all else, a strategist. His wolf called him a liar. 3 days, the old instinct reminded him. The mate bond gave him 3 days from her arrival on Vael territory. 3 days to recognize her, to allow the bond to form, to complete it. After that, the window closed permanently. He would never bond with another. His wolf would spend the rest of his life knowing what had been refused. Many alphas went unmated their entire lives. It was not a death sentence. His wolf disagreed with some force. Caspian checked his reflection once in the darkened glass of the window. Tall, dark-haired, composed, giving away nothing, and walked toward the council chamber. 3 days. And she had come here to stop a war. The irony of it would have been almost funny under different circumstances. Day 1. Midday Mira, she'd been in difficult rooms before. 3 years ago, she'd negotiated fishing rights between 2 coastal territories whose hatred for each other went back 4 generations. 2 years ago, she'd talked a border lord down from executing 12 prisoners by finding him a face, saving alternative in the space of 1 conversation. She'd sat across from men who wanted her to fail, men who underestimated her, men who were so certain of their own power that the concept of losing hadn't occurred to them. She knew how to read a room. The Winter Court Council chamber was cold despite the massive fireplace burning along the eastern wall. Stone floors, high ceilings, torches and daylight competing for dominance. A war table dominated the center. Actual maps spread across actual stone, marked with actual troop positions. Not a negotiating table. A war table. The message was deliberate. You came here to prevent something that is already in motion. 4 Vael advisors stood along the walls. Beta Wren stood at the table's edge, his expression giving nothing away. And at the far end of the table, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out the narrow window at the courtyard below, stood the Alpha King. He didn't turn when she entered. The room had a quality of held breath, advisors watching her, Wren watching her, everyone waiting for something she didn't yet understand. She walked to the table and stopped, not too close, not too far, and waited. After a long moment, Caspian Vael turned around. Later, Mira would have difficulty explaining exactly what happened in the moment their eyes met. It was an attraction, though he was objectively striking. Dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with gray eyes so pale they were almost silver. It wasn't recognition, because she'd never seen him before in her life. It was more like a sound. She hadn't known she was listening for suddenly starting to play. She filed this sensation under irrelevant and held his gaze steadily. His expression was controlled, perfectly so. But something moved behind those silver eyes that she couldn't name. It was there and gone in less than a second. "Envoy Ashvane," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. The voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising it. "Your Majesty," she replied, inclining her head precisely enough to be respectful without being servile. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." A pause. "I almost didn't, Blunt." She could work with Blunt. "I know," she said. "The preliminary terms were an insult. I want you to know I'm aware of that." The advisor to his left made a sharp sound. Wren's eyebrow rose. Caspian Vael went very still. "They were," he agreed carefully.
"It," he said finally. She sat. The first session lasted 3 hours. It was the most complex, exhausting, and strangely exhilarating negotiation of her career. Caspian Vael was nothing like his reputation as a brutal warlord, and the remise which Humanos that he was in whist resolve. He was precise, informed, and willing to engage with the actual substance of the dispute rather than posturing around it. He pushed back hard on Aldenmere's territorial claims, but with specific counter-evidence she had to genuinely work to address. He asked questions she hadn't anticipated about the missing scouts that made her suddenly uncertain about what she thought she knew. By the end of the session, they hadn't reached agreement on anything, but they'd mapped the real shape of the dispute rather than the political performance of it. As the meeting concluded and advisors gathered papers, Mira caught Caspian watching her across the table, not aggressively, just watching, with that same quality of contained intensity she'd noticed when they first met. Reen appeared at her elbow. "I'll show you to your chambers." As she was leaving, she heard one of Caspian's advisors murmur something to him in the vile dialect she only partially understood. She caught 2 words clearly. 3 days. She didn't know what it meant. She filed it away regardless. Chapter 4. What the Wolf Knows. Day 1 night. Caspian. She was better than he'd expected. He sat alone in his study long after the evening meal, staring at notes he made during the session and barely seeing them because his mind kept returning to moments he had no business dwelling on. The way she'd opened the negotiation by acknowledging the insult of the terms before he could raise it. The stillness she held when she was listening. A quality of complete attention he recognized because he practiced it himself. His wolf had been a problem the entire 3 hours. The mate bond was designed by nature to be completed, not endured. Every moment in the same room with her and the bond not yet formed had been a sustained act of will. He'd controlled his scent, controlled his expression, controlled the gold that wanted to bleed into his eyes every time she looked directly at him. She hadn't noticed. Humans couldn't smell what he was holding back. Wren knocked and entered without waiting for an answer, which was his particular method of indicating that what he had to say was too important for ceremony. "Well," Caspian said. Wren sat across from him and was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was choosing his words carefully. "She doesn't know." "Know what specifically?" "She doesn't know Seven sabotaged the preliminary terms. She believes she came here with a genuine opening position that she expected you to reject. She's been building her own counter framework since she got here, working from what she learned today." He paused. "She's also, I think, beginning to suspect her delegation isn't entirely loyal to her mission. Caspian absorbed this. 7. Lord Devon, her escort captain, reports directly to 7. 2 of Mira's dispatches have already been intercepted before they could leave Vael territory. Caspian's jaw tightened. She's being isolated? Yes. Wren's voice was careful now, knowing the territory they were entering. Caspian, she has no idea what she is to you. I know. If you don't tell her, I know, Wren. A silence. 2.5 days left, Wren said quietly. After that, I know what happens after that. Whatever else is happening, this territory needs peace more than it needs another war. She came here to find a real solution. I'm not going to poison that because if he stopped, I'm not going to use her situation to manipulate the outcome. Wren nodded once, slowly. And if she finds a solution, if she succeeds, then she goes home, Caspian said. The words tasted exactly as terrible as he'd expected, and if she doesn't, he didn't answer. Outside the window, the mountain wind moved through the vine-covered walls of his stronghold, and somewhere in the guest wing, his mate was almost certainly still awake, working by candlelight on arguments she built for tomorrow. 2.5 days, he opened his notes and forced himself to focus.
Chapter 5. What the Maids Know, Day 2. Morning Mira. She rose before dawn with the particular alertness of someone whose mind had never fully stopped working. The guest chambers were comfortable, unexpectedly so. A fire had been maintained through the night. Warm water had arrived without her requesting it. The small table by the window held fruit and bread, and something that smelled like spiced tea. And the window itself looked out over the mountain valley below, where the first pale light was beginning to separate the peaks from the sky. Mira stood at the window and thought about what she'd learned yesterday. The gap between Aldenmere's stated position and the actual interests of both kingdoms was significant. She'd spent the previous evening mapping it. What Aldenmere claimed to want, border adjustment, compensation, trade terms, was not what the territory actually needed. What it actually needed was stability, predictable trade access, assurance that the eastern expansion would stop at a definable point. What Vael needed was recognition, legitimacy, a formal treaty that acknowledged their territory's governance as sovereign rather than as a pack of wolves to be managed. Those needs were not incompatible. They were in fact almost perfectly complementary. She was building the framework of a real agreement in her mind when the door opened and a young woman entered with fresh linens, pausing when she saw Mira awake and already at the window. "Forgive me, my lady," I thought. "No." "Please?" Mira said. "Come in." The maid worked efficiently, and Mira watched her with the half attention she always gave to palace staff. Servants knew things. More specifically, servants knew things that their employers assumed they weren't paying attention to. "How long have you served in the stronghold?" Mira asked conversationally. "All my life, my lady. My mother served before me. It's beautiful here." "I hadn't expected that." The maid smiled, genuine warmth. "It's home." A pause. Then, carefully, Mira asked, "Is His Majesty well?" He seemed. She chose the word delicately. "Distracted yesterday." The maid's hands stilled for just a moment on the linen she was folding. It was barely perceptible. A human interviewer might have missed it. Mira didn't miss it. "His Majesty is always well," the maid said, her tone now carefully neutral, in a way it hadn't been before. Something is being protected, Mira noted. Something about his condition. Not illness. She'd have heard whispers of that. Something else. She didn't push. She filed it. Captain Doven was waiting for her in the corridor when she emerged, which was unusual. He'd given her significant space the previous day. "The morning session begins in an hour," he said. "I know." Lord Seven sent instructions overnight. He held out a sealed document. Mira took it, broke the seal, and read. Her face remained perfectly composed as she processed what was written. New instructions. A harder line on the border adjustment. A demand for the scouts' bodies. Remains was the specific word used. Before any treaty could be finalized. An ultimatum framing. Agree to these terms by the end of day 2 or Aldenmere would consider the summit concluded. Designed to collapse the negotiations, she thought clearly. These terms cannot be accepted. He knows they cannot be accepted. He wants me to deliver them so that the failure is mine. She folded the document and tucked it into her coat. "Thank you, Captain," she said pleasantly. She had no intention of delivering those terms. Chapter 6. Lord Seven's Game Day 2. Afternoon Mira. The morning session had gone better than any reasonable expectation. She and Caspian had spent 4 hours dismantling the territorial dispute piece by piece, examining each point of friction for its actual cause rather than its political presentation. The missing scouts, it turned out, had not been killed by Vael wolves. Caspian had produced evidence, witness accounts, patrol records, a confession from a third-party mercenary group that had been operating in the disputed territory that pointed toward a private military contractor working for interests inside Aldenmere itself. Someone who wanted the scouts dead. Someone who wanted the incident to be blamed on Vael. Someone who wanted a war. Mira had asked for time to review the evidence privately. He'd given it to her without hesitation. She'd spent the lunch break reading every document with the focused intensity of someone whose entire understanding of the situation was being systematically revised. The evidence was solid, more than solid. She returned to the table in the afternoon session and said, "I believe you." Caspian had looked at her across the maps and said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "I know. You knew I'd come to that conclusion. I thought you would, yes, not smug, matter of fact. You're too thorough not to." Mira had the strange sensation of being accurately seen by someone who had no reason to look closely at her. She set it aside. They'd spent the afternoon building the actual framework of a real treaty. Border demarcation that recognized Vael's existing settlements without expanding their territory further. Trade terms that gave Aldenmere stability while acknowledging Vael's sovereignty. A joint investigation into the mercenary contractors that had operated in both territories. By evening, Mira had a treaty that was genuinely good for both kingdoms, and she had absolutely no way to deliver it. She was sitting alone in her chambers, staring at the document she'd drafted, when the knock came. Not Doven, whose knock she'd learned to recognize. Not the maid. She opened the door. Wren stood in the corridor, alone, out of his formal attire, looking like a man who had made a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "May I come in?" he asked. Mira stood aside. He entered, looked at the draft treaty on her table, looked at her, and said, "How much do you know about wolf-mate bonds?" Chapter 7. What the beta says Day 2. evening Mira, she listened without interrupting, which Ren seemed to appreciate. He explained it simply, without embellishment. Fated mates, the recognition, the bond window. 3 days from her arrival on Vael territory, he told her that Caspian had felt it the moment she crossed the border. That he'd spent the first negotiation session fighting his own wolf's instincts with every discipline he had. That if the bond wasn't completed by tomorrow evening, the window would close permanently. He told her what happened to wolf kings who recognized a mate and then lost the bond window. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Mira stood by the window with her arms crossed and looked at the darkened valley below. Her mind was doing what it always did with new information, sorting, connecting, revising her understanding of every previous interaction through this new lens. He knew from the first moment, the stillness when they first met, the quality of attention he gave her that she'd attributed to strategic focus, the way he'd produced that evidence without hesitation, trusting her judgment when he had every reason not to. He could have used it, she realized. He could have leveraged the bond against the negotiations. Told me what I was to him in that first session. Used my confusion, my emotions, to get terms favorable to Vael. He hadn't. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked Ren. "He didn't ask you to." "No," Ren admitted. "He'd be furious if he knew I was here." "Then why?" A pause. "Because you deserve to make a choice with full information," he said. "He won't ask anything of you. That's who he is. He'd rather lose the bond than manipulate someone into accepting it. But that means if nothing changes, tomorrow evening comes, the window closes, and you go home with your treaty and he." Ren stopped. "He'll be fine," he said, in the tone of someone saying something they didn't believe. "What about the treaty?" Mira asked. "He'll honor it regardless. Whatever happens between you personally, the treaty stands on its own." Mira absorbed this. "And 7, Ren's eyes sharpened. "You know, I've known since this morning that someone is trying to collapse these negotiations from the inside." She turned from the window. "The instructions I received this morning. Terms no reasonable party would accept. Dovin intercepting my dispatches." She met Ren's gaze. 7 wants this war. He's been maneuvering toward it for months, possibly years. Ren nodded slowly. "He has a business arrangement with the mercenary contractors. A Vael, Aldenmere war would be extremely profitable for the right kind of intermediary. And I'm the person standing between him and that profit." Mira's voice was steady. "Which means tomorrow, when I bring this treaty to be finalized, he'll move to stop it." "Yes," Ren said. "We believe he'll try to use Dovin to create an incident. Something violent enough to make the summit appear to have collapsed in bad faith. Something that puts the blame on Vael." Silence. "I need to think," Mira said. Ren nodded and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "For what it's worth," he said, "he spent the first session trying not to look at you too much. He thought it wasn't obvious." A brief, quiet almost smile. It was obvious. Then he was gone. Mira stood alone in her chamber for a long time, looking at the treaty she'd spent 2 days building. Thinking about a wolf king who had known from the first moment what she was to him and had chosen to conduct an honest negotiation anyway. She picked up her quill. She had 1 day left and a great deal to prepare. Chapter 8. The third morning, day 3 Caspian. He knew Ren had told her. He'd said nothing about it when Ren returned the previous evening with a carefully neutral expression. He'd simply looked at his beta for a long moment and returned to the maps he wasn't really reading. "She deserved to know," Ren said. "I know," Caspian replied. And he did know. It was why he hadn't forbidden it, even though some part of him wished he had. The part that found it easier to face the loss of something if he'd never allowed himself to want it openly. He'd barely slept. The wolf was close to the surface now, pressing against his control with the urgency of a clock running out. 2 days of proximity and the bond wanting completion had worn his discipline thin in ways he couldn't afford to show. He was standing on the training ground before dawn, working through forms that required enough concentration to force his mind to stillness when he heard footsteps he recognized. He stopped. Mira Ashvane crossed the training ground toward him with the directness that he was learning was simply how she moved through the world. No performance, no approach. Just a woman walking toward a thing she decided needed to be addressed. She stopped a few feet away. Her dark coat was dusted with frost. She'd clearly been up before him. They looked at each other in the pre-dawn gray. "You should have told me," she said. No accusation in it, just the statement of a fact. "Yes," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" He considered giving her a diplomatic answer, decided against it. "Because I needed you to trust that the negotiations were real. If you thought I had a personal stake in keeping you here, you'd have questioned everything." She considered this. "That's logical." It was also, he said, easier to pretend for 3 days that you were simply an envoy and I was simply a king. He paused. "I didn't want you to feel pressured by something you had no choice in." Mira was quiet for a moment. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. "Ren told me what happens at the end of the window," she said carefully. "I know."
Caspian, his name in her mouth, the first time she'd used it directly. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as information, not as," she paused, choosing words with that precision he'd come to associate with her, "not as something said under the influence of what you are to me, because I don't know yet what that is. I just know what I've observed." He waited. "Wise?" "Piecel. You conducted an honest negotiation when you could have manipulated me. You produced evidence that helped my case when sharing it cost you leverage. You have governed these territories," she gestured toward the stronghold, "with a care for your people that contradicts everything my kingdom has been told about you." She met his eyes steadily. "Someone has been lying about you, deliberately, and I intend to find out everything today." Something moved in his chest that had nothing to do with the bond. "Seven will try to stop the treaty signing," he said. "I know. I have a plan." She glanced toward the horizon. "But I need your complete honesty today about everything. No more managed information." "Agreed," he said immediately. A pause. Something shifted in her expression, brief and unguarded. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "I want you to know that, whatever today brings." Caspian looked at her in the growing light. This small, precise, ferociously competent woman who had arrived in his territory 3 days ago, carrying someone else's sabotage, and had dismantled it piece by careful piece, while simultaneously building the best treaty framework he'd seen in a decade of governance. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been waiting for it and it never comes." A ghost of a smile. "That's either very reassuring or very concerning." "Possibly both." She turned toward the stronghold. The signing session begins at midday. Whatever 7 has planned, he'll move before then. She paused without turning back. I'd appreciate having Ren nearby. He'll be there, Caspian said. So will I. Chapter 9, The War Table, Day 3, Midday, Mira. The morning moved quickly. Mira spent 2 hours with the full treaty document, refining language, anticipating challenges, building the case for every contested point. She sent a dispatch note through Dovan, through a Vael courier she'd arranged with Ren directly to the king of Aldenmere, bypassing 7 entirely, with a full evidence of the mercenary contractors and a summary of the treaty framework. She told Dovan the morning session had been moved. She was watching from a window when Dovan left the stronghold at speed, presumably to send word to 7. Good Dovan at Mira's right, where she could see him. 7 arrived late. He swept in with the confidence of a man who believed himself to be the most powerful person in any room he entered. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed, wearing the smile of someone with a card he hadn't played yet. Mira watched him assess the room and had the satisfaction of seeing him register, briefly, that something was different from what he'd expected. Lord 7, she said warmly. I'm glad you could join us. Mira Ashvane. He took a seat at the table's end. I understand negotiations have progressed. Significantly, she agreed. We're here to finalize and sign. Wonderful. His smile didn't shift. Though I have some concerns about the terms as drafted. The border provisions specifically. He produced a document, the instructions he'd sent her that morning, the deliberately unacceptable ones. I believe these represent Aldenmere's actual position. They don't, Mira said simply. A silence. I beg your pardon? Those terms were drafted by you, Lord 7, without royal authorization, for the purpose of collapsing these negotiations. She kept her voice pleasant, conversational. I sent the king a full brief this morning, including the evidence that the missing scouts were killed by contractors working for interests connected to your office. He should be reading it approximately now. The room went very still. 7's smile disappeared. Something cold and calculating replaced it. Captain, you've been intercepting my dispatches on Lord 7's instructions. Dovan's hand moved toward his sword. He'd barely touched the hilt when Ren moved. Fast, wolf, fast. The kind of speed that humans didn't fully track until it was over. Dovan found himself facing a man whose hand was on his wrist and whose eyes had gone gold. I wouldn't, Ren said quietly. This is an act of aggression against Aldenmere, 7 said, his voice rising. The Alpha King has ordered nothing, Caspian said. His voice hadn't changed. He was sitting at the table's head with his hands flat on the wood and his silver eyes on 7, and the quality of his stillness was the most dangerous thing in the room. Envoy Ashvane identified a threat to the peace process. My beta neutralized it. That's not aggression, that's security. 7 looked between them, calculating his remaining options, Mira knew. She watched him do it. You'll never get Aldenmere to honor this treaty, he said finally. Whatever you sign today, I have enough influence at court to Lord 7. Mira's voice was still pleasant. The king is reading the full evidence package right now, including your financial arrangements with the Harrow mercenary group, including the instructions you sent me this morning. She paused. I'd be focusing less on the treaty and more on what happens when you return to the capital, if I were you. The silence that followed had a different quality than the previous ones, the kind of silence that meant something had shifted irreversibly. 7 stood. His face had gone the particular pale of a man who has just understood that he has lost. He laughed without another word. Mira looked at the treaty on the table in front of her and then at Caspian across it. "Shall we?" she said. Something moved in his expression, something she was beginning to be able to read. "Yes," he said. "Let's finish it."
Chapter 10. What She Chooses. Day 3 evening. Another copy went to the Aldenmere royal record through the same secure route Mira had used that morning. 7's copy sat on the table unsigned and no one mentioned it. The advisors filtered out. Wren left last, with a look at Caspian that Mira interpreted as both "I told you so" and "please don't waste this," and then they were alone. Mira stood by the window where the late afternoon light was turning the valley below to gold. The treaty was done. The war was, if not prevented entirely, then significantly less inevitable. The king of Aldenmere would receive evidence that his chief advisor had been conducting private wars for personal profit. 7 would face consequences. She had done what she came to do. She should be preparing to leave. "When does the window close?" she asked without turning. A pause. "Sunset," Caspian said. His voice was controlled. She was learning to hear what was underneath the control. She turned. He was standing near the war table, not looking at her. His gaze on the maps they'd spent 3 days bent over. In the worn light, he looked less like a king and more like a man who was very carefully not allowing himself to want something. "Wren told me what you lose if the bond doesn't complete," she said. "Not just the mate bond, your wolf, the human side eventually. I'd like to point out," he said carefully, "that I didn't ask Wren to tell you any of this with the intention of—" "I know," she interrupted. "That's rather the point." He looked at her then. "I don't know what a mate bond feels like," Mira said. "I don't know if what I felt over the past 3 days is the beginning of one, or just," she paused, searching for honesty, "the result of 3 very intense days in close proximity with a person I found unexpectedly worth knowing." She held his gaze. "But I know what I've observed. I know who you are in a negotiation under pressure when you think no one is testing you." She took a step toward him. "Why? I know you chose honesty when manipulation would have served you better. I know you govern these territories with a genuine care for the people in them. I know that when I told you I had a plan this morning, you said agreed without asking what the plan was." A muscle worked in his jaw. "I'm not choosing this because of a bond window," she said clearly. "I want to be absolutely honest about that because you have been absolutely honest with me and you deserve the same. I don't know yet if I love you. I don't know yet what this becomes." She stopped a foot away from him. "What I know is that I want to find out. And I know that choosing not to is something I'd regret for reasons that have nothing to do with instinct." "Mira," he said. Just her name. Something in it that caused him. "I've made decisions with less information than this," she said. "And they've been the right ones." He looked at her for a long moment. That quality of attention she'd noticed from the first day, complete and unguarded now, nothing held back. Then he reached out and touched her face, one hand, his palm against her cheek, careful and unhurried. And the bond completed like a door she hadn't known was open, finally swinging wide. It wasn't violent. It wasn't overwhelming in the way she'd half feared. It was more like recognition, the sound she'd been waiting for, finally resolving into a melody she understood. She felt the edge of something enormous and old and utterly certain, and on the other side of it, like hearing a voice through a wall that had always been there, she felt him, the part of him that had been held at careful distance for 3 days. He made a sound she suspected he'd never made in front of another person. something raw and relieved and quietly undone. She put her hand over his on her face. Outside, the sun touched the mountains. Chapter 11, The Bond Both. They stood in the winter court as the light changed. Caspian's forehead came down to rest against hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The bond settled between them, like something that had always existed and simply needed permission to be acknowledged. His wolf, which had been fighting against the surface for 3 days, went quiet in a way it hadn't since before she'd crossed his border. This is what peace feels like, he thought distantly. I'd forgotten. You're warm, Mira said softly against his temple. He pulled back enough to look at her. What? You're warm? She looked faintly surprised. You weren't before. You were cold. Your hands at the treaty table. She touched his hand, which was indeed warm now, the cold he'd carried for years while his wolf fought an unresolved bond finally releasing. What does that mean? It means, he said slowly, that the bond was already making me pay for refusing it. He looked at his hands with a quality of wonder. I didn't realize how long I'd been cold. She absorbed this with the focused attention she gave everything. Then she turned it into something lighter. Well, at least I won't need extra firewood, he laughed. It surprised him, not the laugh itself, but how easily it came, how little he had to manage it. She looked up at him with an expression he would spend a long time learning to fully read, but that he understood the core of immediately. Curiosity, warmth, the particular brightness of someone who had decided, fully and without reservation, to be interested in something. In him, what happens now? She asked practically. With the treaty, the court, my return to the capital, the treaty stands on its own, he said. Whatever you decide about us, the peace holds. That isn't conditional? She nodded, unsurprised. I know, but if you wanted, he stopped. Started again with more care. If you chose to stay, or to return and come back, or any version of any arrangement that allows this, he indicated the space between them to become what it has the possibility of becoming. He held her gaze. I would build whatever structure around it serves you. Your work, your life, your choices. None of that changes. Mira was quiet for a moment. That is possibly the most diplomatic declaration of interest I've ever heard, she said. I have had 2.5 days to prepare it, he admitted. She smiled. It was the first full smile he'd seen from her, not the diplomatic smile she deployed deliberately, not the controlled amusement she allowed herself in unguarded moments, but a genuine one that reached her eyes and transformed her face and made something in his chest feel like the sun coming out. Then, here is my counter-proposal, she said, matching his tone. I return to the capital, manage the aftermath of Seven's arrest, and ensure the treaty ratification goes through the proper channels, which will take approximately 6 weeks. She tilted her head. After which, I would be available to discuss the terms of a longer arrangement. 6 weeks, he repeated. The first 4 you'll barely notice, she said. The last 2 you'll find unreasonably long. And you? He asked quietly. How will you find them? A pause. Probably unreasonably long, she admitted. He took her hand warm, both of them warm now, and brought it to his lips the way he had on the first day, formal and deliberate. Except this time, when her eyes met his, she wasn't calculating the political implications of a king's gesture. This time, she just looked at him. 6 weeks, he agreed. 8 months later, the second treaty was not about war. It took free drafts and more negotiation than the original peace accord. partly because both parties were somewhat more emotionally invested in the outcome than was strictly professional, and partly because Mira's standards for contractual language were exacting in a way that Caspian found simultaneously admirable and extremely time-consuming. The third draft was ratified on a clear morning in the stronghold's main hall, with both kingdoms' ambassadors present and Beta Ren watching from the side with an expression that said, "I told you so clearly it barely needed a face." Afterward, Caspian walked with Mira through the vine-covered walls of the stronghold, the spring growth green and vivid, where autumn fire had been when she'd first arrived. She had her treaty copy tucked under one arm and was making notes on a small pad with her free hand, which he'd come to understand was simply how she moved through the world, always annotating, always building the next argument. "You're going to be a very complicated queen," he said. "You knew that when you signed the last treaty," she pointed out without looking up. "I considered it a feature." She looked up at that, and he had the gift of watching that smile arrive. He'd spent 8 months learning the taxonomy of her expressions, and he still wasn't tired of this one. "The council won't know what to do with me," she said. "The council has been needing someone to disagree with them for years," he said. "I've been told I'm too intimidating to argue with." "That does seem like a design flaw in your management approach." "Yes," he agreed. "I thought so too." She stopped walking and turned to face him fully in the spring light, tucking the treaty under her other arm and looking at him with that complete attention that still, 8 months in, felt like being precisely and entirely seen. "I want to be clear," she said, which was how she always began the things that mattered to her. "I'm not doing this because of the bond." "I know," he said. "I mean," she paused, "the bond is real. I feel it, it's part of this. But it isn't," she searched for the word, "sufficient on its own. What's sufficient is what I've observed," she held his gaze. "Who you are when the negotiation is over. Who you've been when there was nothing left to prove." He thought of all the ordinary evenings of the past months. Arguments about treaty language that became arguments about philosophy, that became conversations neither of them had planned to have about things that mattered deeply and privately to both. The particular quality of quiet when they sat in the same room working on different things. The moment she'd first trusted him with something that wasn't about politics. "What did you observe?" he asked, because he wanted to hear it. "Someone worth choosing," she said simply, repeatedly. Every day, Caspian took her hand. Outside the stronghold walls, the valley spread green and gold in the spring morning. 2 kingdoms learning to share a border, a peace that had been one woman's work and one man's honesty, and 3 days that had somehow turned out to be enough. "I should tell you," he said, "that when you eventually meet the full council, they will almost certainly test you. Of course they will. And that 3 members in particular have strong opinions about Caspian," she said. "Yes. Stop negotiating." She laced her fingers through his. "We're done for the day." He looked at her in the spring light, this woman who had arrived in his court to stop a war and had stayed to build something entirely different, precise and careful and completely her own. "Agreed," he said. For once in his life, the word required no effort at all.